posted his first ever. This past week, David Attenborough posted his first ever message on Instagram. He did so at the age of 94, and within 4 hours, he'd become the person who now holds the record for attracting 1 million online followers in the fastest time. It wasn't long before he had 2 million followers, and one of the first to welcome him online was the tennis player Andy Murray. David Attenborough is one of the most celebrated figures of our time. He is known widely and deeply respected for his wonderful television series to do with the mysteries of our natural world, God's good creation. Have you seen The Life of Birds, The Private Life of Plants, The Blue Planet, The Life of Mammals, Our Planet, The Great Barrier Reef with David Attenborough? Did you see the series decades ago which featured Fiji, The People of Paradise? The list goes on. It's no surprise then that he so quickly attracted 1 million followers. His message was to the point. He's not really that much in favor of social media, but he wished to speak to a younger generation, and to do so on matters to do with the future well-being of the earth in the days ahead, when he says he will no longer be with us. And his message? I am making this move because, as we all know, the world is in trouble. Continents are on fire, glaciers are melting, coral reefs are dying, and this list goes on and on. Last year, Mary and I were able to carry out a pastoral ministry in Kintyre on the Isle of Gigha on the west coast of Scotland. The sunsets were beyond compare. Every day you looked forward to what the evening would bring. Towards the end of our time, the BBC One hosted one of the most watched television programs in recent times. It featured David Attenborough explaining the facts of climate change. It was compelling viewing. The next day and the days that followed, there was so much discussion in the media, on TV, on radio, in newspapers, online, and in everyday conversation. The formal debate in the United Kingdom on climate change and the need to reduce carbon emissions is very different from what it is like here in this country. Right across the political spectrum, it is recognized that we must act, and we must act quickly. In this kind of landscape, no one sought to undermine David Attenborough, nor disparage his message. According to Joël Burgess, author of The History and the Future of Climate Change in Australia, climate scientists in this country can be subject to the most appalling abuse. David Attenborough came across as a trustworthy figure, someone to listen to, someone to revere. And while he was speaking in the streets of some cities like London, a movement called Extinction Rebellion was blocking traffic, disrupting work, protesting because of levels of concern. David Attenborough thinks highly of Greta Thunberg. He's told her that she has woken up the world, but he sounds a word of warning with regards to the acts of Extinction Rebellion. The truth to tell, if you listen carefully to Earth system scientists like Will Stephan of the Australian National University, a worldwide authority, the prospects for the future are not that bright. Whenever I check up on what this globally acclaimed scientist has to say, I think of the Apostle Paul's reference in Romans to a groaning creation. A groaning creation. No other major faith in the world has that idea, that way of looking at the world. That is, a groaning creation. And that turn to the epistles to Paul leaves me wondering about how might we, the members of the church, the followers of Jesus Christ, respond to the plight of the earth, our earth, and which, despite probes to Mars and beyond, remains our home, our only home, as one NASA clip reminds us. How do we respond in the light of our bearing the name of Christ? Remember then the end of the Sermon on the Mount.
Each of those who hears my words and does them is like the wise person who builds their house on rock.
That word for house in Greek is not just the equivalent of your home, your unit, your apartment. It can also refer to the household of the whole creation, the oikos of God. Indeed, we get the words for ecology and economics from this Greek word. Forget for a moment about economists in the Treasury helping budgets for a moment. Forget about the modern phenomenon of men and women loaded with economics degrees. The first being ever to attract of talk of being an economist was, believe it or not, God, who was a long time ago called the Divine Economist, who seeks to manage, restore, and reconcile the household of a groaning creation.
Each of those who hears my words.
Of course, Jesus of Nazareth was no David Attenborough. He was not a climate activist ahead of his time. And first century Palestine did not know about carbon emissions. And Jesus didn't film any documentaries of a planet having to deal with these pressures. But if you read carefully, if you pay attention to what is actually in the Gospels, time and time again he goes apocalyptic in a way that can shock us because of our desire for a gentle, meek and mild Jesus. We can sometimes find something quite different, something rather strange. Jesus warns about imminent endings, times of judgment, and cataclysmic natural events. It's in the text. It's easy to push these sayings to one side and call to mind other aspects of his teaching that we feel more comfortable with. But maybe we should pay heed to these events and then note how, in the midst of his ministry, Jesus gives his one and only weather report. Now, you won't find it on Channel 7. There is no brownie. It comes instead at the end of Luke 12.
Jesus also said to the crowds, "When you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say, 'It's going to rain,' and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, 'There will be scorching heat,' and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?"
Of course, it's not our kind of weather report. The wind bringing the rain and heat are coming from the wrong directions. And we would like to know more about whether it is an El Nino or La Nina year. We would like to know more about East Coast lows and southerly busters, cyclones and the Indian Ocean dipole. Nevertheless, Jesus bids us to consider the weather and how we interpret the present time. The word is actually kairos time, which is not the same as what you find on your watch or on the calendar. It has got nothing at all to do whether you spring forward into summertime or fall back. It is rather the right time. It is the opportune time. And in the context of the Bible, it is God's time. It is the moment when something is revealed, when something breaks into our world and we are called to discern the signs of the times. Imagine you are being interviewed. You are being asked to discern the signs of our times. What would you say? At this particular point in time in our history, we are immersed in all the changes happening in the mission, and that would be one of the things that no doubt would come to the fore. But in the big picture of things, in the light of what is actually happening in the world, that would hardly feature. It is a blip on the screen. I can imagine someone might say COVID-19 and how we manage pandemics and seek good health is a sign of the times. But I suspect that future historians looking back will say that the key sign of our times is climate, how it is changing, and how it is already affecting some things, some people quite drastically. We might say that David Attenborough's message on Instagram this week was his way of discerning the signs of the times. This weekend is the first weekend of the new fire season. This time last year, I was suggesting that as the people of Christ in this place, we should be thinking about how we care for one another and for those in need, and how we use our resources in times of extreme heat, the silent killer, in times of drought, in times of hazardous air. It was a call to be prepared. It is a time to discern the signs of the times, to take a step back and consider what is happening in our world and how we respond in faith. Which leads me to pose another question. One of the stocker questions of the Christian life is the one Jesus posed to his disciples. Who do you say that I am? It is sometimes said that this is the one question which haunts every generation of Christians. And we might rightly say it is the key, the absolutely core question before us in this time of many changes in the mission, as well as in the time of COVID-19. Who do you say that I am? How we answer and what we say and what we don't say will reveal a lot about ourselves. It's that kind of question. Who do we say Jesus is in a time when God's good creation is under threat and where there are so many ways to soften the impact of that concern? It is a question we should ask, for let us remember that Jesus was indeed declared to be the beloved Son of God, the same God who we confess to be the creator of all that is. Remember the last day of the first creation story Julie read? God rests and declares the creation to be very good. So often in the past, the church has looked upon this world as a place to escape from. It's there in our hymns. Norman Harbell from Adelaide writes about how we have often privileged what he calls heavenism and downplayed the value of the earth, this creation. That way of thinking is, of course, a far cry from the prayer Jesus taught us and which featured in our gospel reading this morning.
Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Your will be done on earth.
This earth which God declared on that Sabbath to be very good and which elsewhere was placed in our care. All of this may come as a surprise. There are some who would say, but it's not the gospel. And yet I have been haunted again by the writings of one of the first wave of high-profile women theologians, Sally McFaig, whom I first came across when I first began to preach and teach and write in this field 30 years ago. She spoke about how if we did not care for God's creation, then we run the risk of creating uncreation. We run the risk of reversing God's first Sabbath. And then she added that were we to do that, then is that not an act of heresy? It is not a matter of political preference, which side of the aisle you favour. It is a matter of heresy. McFaig went a step further. She said it is sinful. And like the prodigal son who has expended all of his resources, now is the time to come to our senses. Let me press just a little further. Jesus asked his disciples,
Who do you say that I am?
It will soon be Christmas. It is often the custom to finish the Christmas Day service with a reading from the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word is Christ Jesus, and in this prologue, the Word is with God at the very dawn of creation. We're probably more used to thinking of Jesus in terms of his life and ministry, his death and resurrection, and not so much in this cosmic sort of way that lifts us out of the constraints of our own time. In this prologue, Christ, the Word, is with God in the act of creation. On Christmas Day, we celebrate a new creation story with Christ at its very centre, a Christ who is depicted as being a source of light and life. but who can also be rejected. It reminds me of our reading this morning from the Epistles to the Muslians. Do you know it? Is it familiar? It's worth being a biblical Instagram message, though originally it was an early hymn. The Colossians passage speaks of
how all things were made through, in, and for Christ.
Let me repeat. It speaks of how all things were made
through, in, and for Christ.
In other words, when we seek to care for the Great Barrier Reef, koalas, endangered species, people on low-lying islands facing rising sea levels, then we're caring not just for God's good creation, we are also honouring the Christ, the cosmic Christ, through whom, in whom, and for whom all things were made. And if perhaps you're still a little unsure, read a little bit further and note how the hymn ends. It refers to the gospel being proclaimed to every creature, not just us, but every creature which imagines that the gospel is about us, but not just about us. It is about the whole earth system, God's good creation. This way of reading the signs of the times is not determined by politics. It is not determined by economics. It is a matter of faith, the spiritual life, the Christian ethic. It is a case of how we respond to that searching question Jesus puts.
Who do you say that I am?
David Attenborough posted his first Instagram message at the age of 94. It is time for us to discern the signs of the times and act in the service of the Christ,
through whom, in whom, all things were made.
It is the most important issue by far before us and for our children and their children as well. Amen.